This is my second time recording this because I didn't realize my microphone was turned off while I was recording it the first time. I want you to line up all the factions we've talked about so far and really think about them. The Guardians and humanity by extension are throwing physics-defying super energies at each other and their problems, and if they can, turning them into guns when they're done. The Hive do the same thing, frankly, and the Vex have their own ways of making you grateful this isn't the world we live in. And though the Cabal and Elixni are a little more grounded in their approaches, you can't say some of what they've got going on don't defy expectations and understanding. So if I told you that out of all of them, the one I have the hardest time wrapping my head around is the one faction we never actually get into a war with and are a possible player race, what would you think? Because the Awoken frankly make my head hurt sometimes. They are your classic sci-fi space elves, you know the type. The deeply spiritual or whatever passes for science that's really just magic, mega advanced race that's usually doing better than humanity, likes looking down their noses at them, all before getting pummeled into the dirt at some point so they need us to save their tails. Shift around and subvert a few of these traits all you like, but when you see a space elf, you know it's a space elf. And boy are the Awoken space elves. They've got a history no less dynamic than any of the enemy factions I've discussed so far, and have maintained a mutually beneficial relationship with us since mid-Destiny 1. And yet, when we compare and contrast them to their counterpart in the player races, that being the Exo, well, let's just say it's a little disappointing. Don't misunderstand me. I love all Exo characters, not you, and appreciate what they bring to the table, also not you. But in terms of story and impact, they lack a cohesive character as a group. Hence why they're never referred to as the Exos unless giving a description of an Exo. The Awoken are both a people and a culture. Humanity is both a people and a culture. The Exos are a people, and their culture is humanity. Hence why, for all intents and purposes, the Exos are just humans with a flashy coat. Kind of. There is one aspect of the Exos that gives them spice, but it's one that hasn't been properly touched on since Beyond Light over 4 years ago. So that's what today's video is about. Humanity's cousin, the Awoken and the Exos, in that order, and comparing how they are used and what could be done to make one better in contrast to the other. So let's start with the Sour Cream Kings over here. The Awoken, as I mentioned in my video on the Guardians and by extension humanity, are the result of a colony ship, the Yang Luwei, being caught between the Traveler's Light and the Black Fleet's darkness during the collapse. This clash crushed the ship into a singularity and caused all on board to be disintegrated into potential energies. The crew of the ship left Earth because they were a bunch of angsty teens looking to make a life outside the Traveler's influence, and boy did they get one. Within the singularity, the first consciousness to take form was a woman who called herself Mara Sov. She looked out over this singularity, this distributary, and shaped it with her thoughts, and made it into a mortal world. One where people could struggle and therefore, as she surmised, grow and explore. Mara's life before was as a simple engineer who had a tendency to do things herself and not consult other people for help. This is a trend that will continue into her new life, because rather than simply making the world for her people, she also allowed someone else to believe she was the first to appear and make the world as it was, Elise Lee, who Mara effectively made take the reins of responsibility for the new Awoken people. These Awoken then began to emerge from the wreckage of the Yang Wei, including Mara's mother, Osana, and her brother Uldren, who would be right at her side and often not fully privy to plans. Functionally immortal, if not killed, the Awoken spread out across the forests of the Distributary and indulged in the peaceful, charmed life they now had in what was a paradise far from the conflict of light and dark they were born from. Elise Lee, honored by the people who thought she made them, was elected as their queen. But Mara was not content. She felt they had a responsibility to act and resolve the war beyond that had made them. Did she come out and say this? No, she worked in the shadows and formed a philosophical sect called the Ecolists, put a different person in charge to act as the face of her own work, sound familiar, and then orchestrated a war between them and the Sanguine, that being the opposing sect that believed the Awoken deserved the life they had and the outside world wasn't their problem. The extremist beliefs of the Diasrim, the leader of the Ecolists, were explicitly used by Mara to make her own beliefs seem less extreme, without Mara's involvement being as clear. The war eventually came to an end when the Diasrim vanished going to meet Mara Sov, and Osana negotiated the terms of ceasefire. And that whole conflict only happened so Mara could sow seeds of doubt and guilt into the minds of the Awoken so they'd be more willing to leave the Distributary with her later. The end result was Elisa Lee stepping down as queen and someone else, Naguya Pin, becoming queen. I really hope I said that name right. Mara soon enough inserted herself as Pin's advisor and swayed her further along Ecolist policies, which furthered her goals to find a way out of the distributary. Around this time, an Ecolist paladin named Sior Ido directed her anger towards Mara as she, very likely legitimately, believed Mara had murdered the Diasri. However, rather than assassinating her as intended, Sior was immediately struck by Mara's beauty, which goes to show truly anyone can forget all they stand for in front of a pretty face. Sior challenged her to a duel. Mara chose Uldren to be her representative in said duel, and after 3 rounds of varied combat, it ended in a draw, with Sior swearing her loyalty and love to Mara forevermore. If you're surprised it took me this long to mention Uldren, her brother, again, don't worry. That's just in character for him. The second queen soon got tired of being Mara's puppet and stepped down, so Queen Devna Till, handpicked by Mara, could take her place. And with all the preparations completed by this point, the Awoken who followed Mara were ready to depart. They faced repeated pushbacks from the new queen to even their own mother, Osana, who refused to leave the paradise of the distributary. But plenty more were determined to join them, even if it meant becoming bound by the laws of time and entropy that the real universe would force them under. But they left even so, hurtling out from their ancestral cradle never to return, severing all connection to the Awoken that were left behind. And the harsh world they found themselves in reminded them immediately why their people stayed away. Almost immediately, they were caught in a bad situation, arriving in the solar system in the Reef, aka the asteroid belt, which was littered with the remains of long-destroyed ships obliterated during the collapse. Danger lurked around every corner, but one ray of safety was Mara, as latent, seemingly paracausal abilities, or at least acausal ones, sprung from her after exiting the singularity, quite literally making an aura of safety around her and establishing a telepathic tie to all her people, as if she didn't already have a messiah complex. Uldren fairly quickly discovered the presence of the Traveler and the Last City, both of which had evidently been present for a while, but shorter than the history the Awoken knew. After all, it would seem that time passed quicker in the distributary. The discovery of the Traveler, humanity, and the Last City would pose another threat to Mara's design, as a third of the Awoken splintered from the fleet. You may ask, why wouldn't Mara want to help humanity when they came to resolve the struggle between light and dark? Well, that's because she needs a diverse gene pool. Living under the entropy of a universe hostile to them means the waning of their immortality. Not completely, they're still very long-lived, but aging has clearly affected some Awoken, and Mara was going to need as many Awoken lives as possible to throw into the existential wood chipper. So they attempted to keep them from leaving through force, but that fails, and rather than risking a continued internal conflict, Mara allows the third of the fleet to leave to aid Earth, creating the schism between the Reef-born and Earth-born Awoken. And as the Earthborn left the Reef, their exodus alerted another problem Uldren had ran into: the Elixni. As if confirming Mara's fears, as the Earthborn Awoken touched down to save the lives of their cousins, the Reefborn began fighting the Fallen for their own place in the system. And on that day, Mara was named Queen of the Reef, which wasn't really a decision when she can read and speak into the minds of every Awoken present. That same day, Mara decided to stand truly apart from her people, to stand above them, to reject living as their peer. She would keep secrets not for security, but to shroud the gaps between herself and them, so they could fill in what they didn't know with greater things than she planned. This further enforced the image of Mara as a god to her people, and even Sjur wondered whether it was better for her to worship Mara as a god than love her as a person. In the end, Mara had already made the choice, and it was one solidified when Uldren, at her request to bring something to help them make a city of their own, offered Mara a power that could make a lie into reality. A newborn Ahamkara, a wish dragon that fed on the gap between what was and what was desired. This Ahamkara's name was Riven, and she would be the instrument by which Mara forged a home and city for the Awoken people, a haven called the Dreaming City, a place where the Ahamkara could also dwell from time to time, hence how Riven met her later mate, Tyrannus, and Mara would busy herself in thinking of more ways to achieve greater power, contemplating the sword logic of the Hive and a counter-philosophy she dubbed the bomb logic, being about cooperation and complexity compared to the sword logic's hostility and singularity. The Awoken remained as aloof as their queen from the Last City and its guardians, only occasionally acting for their best interests, such as when they intercepted the House of Wolves, who were off to help the other fallen houses attack the city, erupting into the Reef Wars that saw the House of Wolves subjugated and made to bow before Mara, All while Uldren kept pushing to find ways to live up to what he believed Mara wanted of him, running off to dangerous places and even the Black Garden on Mars to get her attention and surprise her. He didn't, and instead got darkness poisoned, which would go on to fester inside him. The last major event before the start of the game would be the Great Hunt, when the Guardians of the City determined Ahamkara to be too great of a threat due to their tendency to monkey's paw every wish. So the Guardians hunted them to extinction save for Riven, whom Mara sealed inside the Dreaming City away from her mate and eggs as the Guardians eradicated her species. After all, it's very useful for Mara to have the only living wish dragon. I am perhaps being a bit unfair to Mara throughout all this, but it's not the situation I begrudge Mara for, rather how she approaches every situation. Like she knows better. Like she deserves to treat everyone around her as pawns in her game. That her aloof divine posturing is for the best not only for the Awoken as a whole, but for her personal relationships. Uldren himself practically breaks himself over and over again in an attempt to please and impress her, all while she barely takes notice of him unless necessary. A fact she will be forced to come to terms with, and which will cause her no end of grief as a result. An irony that she often criticized or viewed the Traveler antagonistically, when she appears to model her own style of godhood after the Traveler. But whereas the Traveler truly does leave its children to make their own fate, Mara pushes her people towards the fate she thinks is best for them. And when it backfires, boy does it backfire spectacularly. Because those Reef wars became more violent than anticipated, and Mara would lose more than she bargained for as she allied with the difficult-to-explain beings called the Nine, who I have not touched on before because even thinking about them makes my brain hurt. But they're some kind of high-concept planetary entities that exist in council with each other, and they allied with Mara against the House of Wolves. Despite this, the Nine would betray her in two ways. One, they were very likely involved in the death of Sior Ido, as a strange coin, a representation of commerce from them, was left on her body as compensation for Sior's death. And then, after the final leader of the wolves, Skolas, was captured, and he was offered to the Nine as a trophy, they released him back into the Reef to begin the Wolf Rebellion, a conflict where the House of Wolves betrayed Mara and forced the Awoken to call on the Guardians of the Last City for the first time. But there was little rest to be had, as almost immediately Oryx was on his way to the system, a threat Mara knew she couldn't avoid, so she called on the help of Eris Morn to teach her and her tech witches, the Techians, how to mold the sword logic, and how to implement her own bomb logic through it, crafting a throne world of her own and preparing for the greatest threat the Awoken had faced. During this waiting period, she had a certain visitor, and, I'm just going to take this chance to cover one thing I've been shouted at by, well, a lot of people, honestly. I am aware that the current interpretation of Shax's meeting with Mara Sov was strictly, well, I don't know if I'd call it platonic, but non-physical. If I'm being totally honest though, and I have researched this, I've yet to find an exact lore passage that confirms this, and I'm inclined to believe their relationship wasn't entirely platonic, considering Riven, an Ahamkara that can read people's minds and desires, knew that she could pretend to be Shax professing his love to Mara to get under her skin, as well as through Riven's wording implies that they knew each other intimately. Now, spade to spade, the word intimately doesn't necessarily have to mean physically, but I hope some of you can see why that was my interpretation of their relationship. Now, stop commenting about it. I get it. Anyway, back to the actual video. At this rate, some of you are going to make me pop a blood vessel. All of this preparation, however, was for a grand trap, with her people as the bait. She and her fleet met Oryx in battle and were obliterated, only leaving a single gash on the dreadnought when Oryx's power wiped them out. Seemingly, the entire fleet. Mara would die and Uldren would vanish. But in fact, this was Mara's plan from the start. A sacrifice she made of her own people as she escaped into the Ascendant Realm and waited to make her return while the Guardians finished her job. While she was gone, however, everything turned to crap. Uldren resurfaced, corrupted by darkness and whispered to by Riven, who had been taken by Oryx and now manipulated by Savathun, the Witch Queen. Uldren's care for an Elixni named Fikrul, who was dying, was warped by both his own and Riven's darkness to revive Fikrul as the first Scorn. Uldren's love for Mara and refusal to believe her dead became the catalyst Riven needed to drive him against those he once loved. And with his scorn and an obsessive desire to find his sister, Uldren began a one-man crusade against his own, ending with the deaths of countless Awoken, Cade Six's final stand, and Uldren Sov, Mara's own brother, another casualty of Mara's plans gone awry. And trust me, that part was not a part of her grand design. Riven, meanwhile, would have to be killed, but not before using her death as a catalyst to trap the Dreaming City in a taken curse that it remains in even to this day. Oh, and Uldren was resurrected as a guardian named Crow. Crow had a hard enough time himself, getting repeatedly murdered by guardians who saw his face and recognized Uldren, and becoming indentured to the spider. But don't worry, we made him one of us in due time. All of that is what Mara ultimately returned to just in time for Savathun to make her own gambit, claiming the light for the Hive after bamboozling Mara into freeing her from her worm. Overall, all of Mara's well-laid plans exploded in her face like that bomb logic. And why? Because in all those cases, Mara thought she could predict those around her. She thought she understood what motivated Riven. She thought she knew what drove Uldren. She thought she could outsmart Savathun, and her hubris caught her repeatedly. In fact, it would be Uldren's new life as Crow, living as a stranger to her, that forced Mara to consider that her plan of keeping him and her people at arm's length was what got them into this situation to begin with. Her being humbled by Savathun, a witch queen far older and smarter than her, was the final straw that started her down a road of change. It was slow, after all, it's hard to undo an entire lifetime of pride, but she has grown more openly empathetic, allowed herself to be human to those around her rather than a self-designed god. And it's a lesson the Awoken had to learn before she could. The Awoken looked down on humanity, the Traveler, Guardians, and their Earthborn cousins, but when push came to shove they had to call for help from somewhere, and the city was all there was to turn to. It forced barriers to break, made the arrogant humble, and forged bridges where otherwise there wouldn't have been, and most of that had to be done without Mara around to tell them to. The Awoken and the city were already allied by the time Mara returned, and took reign of a people that had been moving on without her, and now she and her Awoken are the steadiest allies humanity could ask for. With the union of the two cities forging the backbone of the coalition that would defend our solar system from all threats from beyond. With a history and story like that, one could see how the Awoken are meant to parallel with many other forces. Mara and Savathun act as foils to each other in a pretty obvious way. The Awoken, standing between light and dark, were an early indicator of the story moving towards us as guardians wielding both light and dark forces, as well as giving some extra meat to the setting so it doesn't feel like we're the only people in it that aren't actively trying to blow up the Traveler. Although Mara has considered doing it before. We all know that if she tried, though, she'd have been turned into a gun by now. So I want you to sit with all this information I just gave you. And now listen to the story of the Exos. Once upon a time, before the collapse, a terrible, awful human being named Clovis Bray I was trying to create robotic people, but couldn't find a way to accurately transplant human consciousness into them. That was until he made contact with the darkness via an artifact on the moon, and followed its instructions to Europa, where he set up shop and also stole a Vex unit from the Ishtar Collective on Venus. Then he made a portal to a Vex Forge Star to study the Vex, and then used Vex Radiolaria combined with darkness to craft the Exos as we understand them. And to prevent the copied minds from rejecting the new bodies, Bray introduced both human mannerisms, such as a desire to eat and reproduce, into their inner workings, and the reboot process, which would subdue older memories to make the current mind and body more acclimated to each other, with each successive reboot being denoted by an additional number after their name, Saint 14, Cade 6, 801, and so on. From then on, until and after the collapse, the Exos integrated into human society. Boom. That's it. See what I mean when I say the Awoken are a people and a culture, while the Exos are a people with the culture of humanity? That's not even a bad thing, really, as the lack of a shared identity has been used to varying degrees for interesting storytelling. Look at Cade 6, who, like many Exo Guardians, had vague memories of his pre-Guardian life and used them as an anchor for himself in hard times. Or how Maya Sundaresh, aka the Conductor, used Exos as experiments, torturing the minds inside who were no less human than you or me, but the ability to reboot them made them valuable for her purposes. Or the GOAT, Banshee 44, the Tower Gunsmith that's been rebooted so many times that he's begun to experience effectively exodementia. And he's also the exofied mind of Clovis Bray himself. At least, one of them. Some of you who know the lore better might wonder why I didn't go into the life and story of Clovis Bray or the events that happened on Europa that led to Banshee's creation, and the Vex outbreak that he and Elizabeth Bray had to subdue. But here's the thing. Whenever I go into a deep dive on a central character for one of these videos, whether about Oryx, Keitel, or Mara, it's because those characters have a central story that reflects on the rest of their people. They act as an archetype or a guidepost for the group, mirroring them in development and theme. But the Exos? They don't have that. Clovis is far from representative of the Exos, and the events on Europa weren't known to most of the system, let alone most Exos. And as I said, there's not even a central identity for the Exos to have a focal character for. The closest we might get is Rasputin, the war mind who was also created by Clovis, but again, he isn't representative of the Exos as a whole. It's a matter of two approaches to creating a race or group. One is defined by its history, and the other is defined by its lack of one. The rich story of the Awoken versus the aching homelessness of the Exo. The fight to reclaim what once was theirs, and the journey to either learn what was yours in the first place or to make something for yourself. And in terms of execution and intrigue, it's just a natural consequence that the Awoken will be more interesting as a group. Individual Exo characters can still be fascinating, but only a handful of times is it rooted in them being Exos. More often, it's because of the foundation of them as characters, while Awoken characters like Mara or Petrovenge have a history within the story of the Awoken that builds on what we see of them. You could argue that means Exo characters have to put in more work to be compelling, and I'd actually agree to a certain extent. Personally, I'd like it if the Exos had gotten a more developed group identity which we could observe in the story itself. The story of how they came to be and the twisted man behind it is interesting, sure, but that speaks more to the Bray family than it does about the Exos. Like the story of Mara and Uldren Sov speak to the Awoken, or Keitel and Callus speak to the Cabal, or the Hive Gods to the Hive, you get the point. It's an underdeveloped part of the world building in a setting that is frankly overloaded with development at times. No kidding, I couldn't blame you for not knowing half the stuff I talk about in these videos based off just the gameplay, when mountains of lore are left in lore tabs and books. It's been a problem that's waxed and waned throughout Destiny's lifetime. And I get it, it's easier to write in just words all these cool, spectacular events or deeply intricate stories than it is to create cutscenes, hire voice actors, and set up game environments for that to take place. Really, I get it. But at a certain point, you have to bite the bullet, pay the bill, and let us see those events ourselves, and fair is fair, we've gotten more of that as time has gone on. Of course, it's dipped in recent months post-Final Shape, with Heresy being the kick in the pants we have been wanting, but that's a familiar trend, isn't it? The game grinding to a halt only for it to get a jolt of life again. That's not healthy, though. It's not a natural story growth. It's the writing equivalent of being brain dead and occasionally getting shock therapy. The comparison between the Awoken and the Exo is part and parcel with the nature of Destiny's story, and while good exists in both, I find it hard to argue that there isn't a fundamental problem with how they go about making the story and what they choose to focus on. The Awoken have gotten 4 seasons and 2 expansions to themselves, and the Exos have only really gotten part of one expansion to have their collective identity expanded on. So maybe give the Exo writers some time in the kitchen. Surely it can't be worse than whatever the Vex are getting up to until Echoes happened. But that's enough hand-wringing. If you enjoyed this video, consider liking, commenting, and subscribing to stay up to date on all my work and everything new you might enjoy. I try to maintain a weekly upload schedule, and so far I'm doing rather well, especially since I've been maintaining it for close to a year now. A great big shout out to all my lovely patrons and channel members generously funding my random tangents and helping me stay motivated into the future. You all are truly wonderful and greatly appreciated. If you want to be a patron or channel member, both are just $3 a month with varying benefits. But both get access to a private Discord server where you can directly interact with me and have a quiet corner of the internet to hang out in. But even if you don't, it's no worries. Just being here watching does more than enough. So as always, Guardians, I have been the Hearth Guy, and I will see you all next time around the hearth. Every story has a beginning, and every story has an ending. And wrapped up in both is the arrogant demand to carve a singular purpose into all of existence. To demand all life bend to the whims of mortal minds, fooling themselves into thinking they're a god. And yet with all that power, they could do nothing about that mega mind looking forehead.